Dictation tests, or tīngxiě, are common in Chinese courses, but many students struggle with them. Here is a guide for how to nail any dictation test. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about tīngxiě, or dictation. This is a good example of a Chinese word that is much more transparent than its English counterpart. So dictation for a second language learner of English doesn't really mean anything, but tīngxiě means listen and write, and that is exactly what this type of test is about. Tīngxiě is extremely common when learning Chinese as your first language, and many Chinese kids do tīngxiě every day, but it's also common for foreign adults learning Chinese to encounter tīngxiě in formal courses. The problem is that many foreign adults learning Chinese are not really prepared for this type of exam. You might not have had it when you went to school at all, and to add insult to injury, you also have the Chinese script to deal with. So how should you prepare for dictation tests, and how do you make sure to nail each one? What most students will default to, and some teachers even recommend, is simply to write the character over and over until you know it. This actually works for a small number of characters, but it becomes prohibitively inefficient in the long run. In essence, if you only want to pass this tīngxiě, you can definitely write the characters over and over until you know them, but if you want to pass many of these and also retain the characters over long periods of time, just doing this won't cut it, and it's an inefficient and bad method anyway. We can do better. So here is the method we're going to discuss in a nutshell. So the first thing you should do is to make sure that you understand the characters and words you're going to learn. This is not limited to the obvious, what these characters mean, but also how they are structured. If they are compounds, what are the components and which functions do these components have? Once you have a basic understanding, look up the stroke order and then write the character a few times just to get a feel for it. Then, when you can write it in one go with some flow, you should stop reviewing like this. You should essentially never copy characters stroke by stroke if your goal is to remember them, and you should never look at the target character as you write it either. You should try to space your reviews out over time, so that essentially means that even if you will write the characters many times, make sure you don't write the same character over and over. Do something else in between, maybe study other characters, read something, or even return to the characters later in the day. Finally, before the actual test, simulate the test on your own to make sure you know what it takes to succeed on the actual exam. Before we go through each step of this method in more detail, I think it's worth to say a little bit about what dictation is, because it's not one monolithic type of activity, and different teachers also perform tīngxiě in different ways. For example, your teacher might simply say the single word you're supposed to write, perhaps followed by a translation to English. They might include a sentence or only use a sentence, and you might be required to write only the word, or perhaps you're required to write the entire sentence. While these are different, the core is still the same, as is captured by the Chinese word tīngxiě. You listen and then you write. Essentially, you need to understand what your teacher says. You then need to know which characters make up the words that your teacher said, and you also need to know how to write these characters by hand. These three components are essentially what you need to succeed with tīngxiě. So the first step is to understand what the teacher says. And for ordinary dictation, this is rarely a problem. You know which words you covered in class, and your teacher will tell you in advance which words they check. And the goal is to check handwriting here, so usually it should be fairly clear which words are meant and what they mean, and your main task is to write them by hand. The listening component is therefore usually not the problem, although if your teacher uses sentences and you find these sentences hard to understand, that can impact your ability to produce the correct target vocabulary as well. However, like I said, this is usually not the main challenge, so I will not talk about it too much in this article, but I have written more about learning how to hear the sounds and tones in Mandarin, as well as a guide to listening comprehension in general, and I will make sure to put links in the show notes. The next step is to know which characters to use to write whatever it is your teacher said. Understanding something doesn't mean you know which characters to write, even if you know how to write the individual characters. For a beginner-friendly example, let's look at the word 工作, meaning to work or work. You need to know which 工 and which 做 it is, and sometimes this can be rather tricky. As a beginner, you might have encountered other characters that are also pronounced gong that could be used here, and you have probably encountered another zuo, which is much more common than this one, the one that means to do. So you need to understand that it means work, and you also need to recall which characters are used to write this word. Since we're dealing with a limited set of vocabulary here, this is also usually not the problem for most students. If you think it is tricky to remember which characters are used to write a specific word, I suggest you check out part 5 in my series The Building Blocks of Chinese, where we talk about making sense of Chinese words. So finally, the third step is to know how to write the specific characters by hand. As I already said, this is usually the main challenge for most students, and this is also what your teacher wants to check with a tīngxǐe. This is the whole purpose of having a tīngxǐe in the first place. Can you write the characters by hand? Since this is so important and also usually the main problem, this is what we will spend the rest of the episode talking about. Before we do that though, I would like to highlight that as a teacher, I don't really like dictation. It focuses too much on handwriting in my opinion, and it also conflates different skills. So for example, if a student doesn't know the answer, it could be because they didn't understand what I said, it could be because they don't know which characters to write, or it could be because they forgot how to handwrite the specific characters they try to write. To me, dictation seems like a relic, something transferred from first language acquisition and school and education in China, and this is something which I think is rarely suited to adult foreigners, but that doesn't stop it from being fairly common. This is also a good opportunity to mention that handwriting can take up a lot of time from other activities. If you try to learn to write by hand everything you can type and say, for example, your progress will be very slow because this takes many times longer than it takes to simply learn to speak and type. And you will then skip other skills that are arguably more important for most learners. This is also an argument that I have developed further in other episodes and articles, so I'll put links in the show notes. In this episode though, I assume that you want to do well on tīngxǐe for some reason, either because you care or because you have to care because of a course you're in. This is not a binary decision though, and it can be very costly to try to aim for 100%. In the title of this episode, I say nail dictation tests, but it's important to realize that aiming for 100% is almost never a good idea, even if you care about handwriting a lot. It becomes increasingly costly to preempt any kind of mistake you might make, so aiming for something below 100% is almost always a good idea. The most reasonable approach here is to think about what you want out of the course, what kind of grades, etc., and then see what kind of scores you need on the dictation tests. If 80% is enough, aim at 80%. If 70% is enough, aim at that. And then spend the time you save by doing this instead of aiming for 100%, reading, listening, or doing anything else that will build your Chinese proficiency in general. This is rather easy to say, but it's hard to put into practice. I personally find it hard to deliberately aim at 80% instead of 100%, even though I know that doing so will save me a lot of time that I can then invest more wisely elsewhere. So when I studied my first year of Chinese, I spent way too much time on handwriting characters because I wanted to do well on the tests and exams, but I should have invested much more of that time into reading, listening, or just conversing in Chinese. Okay, so let's get into the method itself and talk more about how to actually nail your dictation tests if that's what you want. The first step then is to understand the characters that you want to learn. When we first encounter Chinese characters, they look like pictures, perhaps some kind of primitive emoticon or something, but Chinese characters are not pictures. If you're entirely new to characters, I strongly suggest you check out the Building Blocks series that I mentioned earlier, and you can also check out the character course that I built for Skritter, and as usual I'll put links to these things in the show notes. The point is that having a basic understanding of how the writing system works, and then also specific knowledge about the characters that you are learning and are expected to write on the test is crucial. Before you even write the character the first time, look it up. See how it's composed, what the structure is, what the components are, etc. In an ideal world, all this information would be available in your textbook or app or whatever it is you're using to study, but this is almost never the case. The best place to go to for information about specific Chinese characters and how they work is Outlier Linguistics Dictionary of Chinese Characters, which I've reviewed, and I'll put a link in the show notes. This is a one-off purchase for Pleco and is well worth your money. If you really want a free alternative, I suggest you use a site called zi.tools, which I've also introduced and recommended in an article on Hacking Chinese. That one is free, it's on the web, but it's also much messier in Chinese, and it's usually harder to find the information you want, but it is there. Here I also want to say that most other sources, other than the two I just mentioned, are usually not good sources of information for Chinese characters. They will display the wrong components, they will not contain information about what is the sound component, what is the phonetic component, and things like that, and they will just generally reproduce folk etymologies or other misconceptions about how Chinese characters work. I should mention that the point here is not that you should remember everything there is to know about this character, then just preparing this single step would take a long time, and it would be rather pointless. Your goal is to nail this dictation test, not understand the depths of these specific characters. The next step is to also look up the stroke order, and again I have you covered here. I have an article with all the resources you need relating to stroke order, and of course I've put a link in the show notes to that as well. It's not essential that you get the stroke order correct for all characters, but it's better to start with the right one, so you don't have to relearn later, and writing it with the correct stroke order is usually also easier. Once you know how to write the character, write it a few times just to get a hang of how it works, what it feels like to write the entire character. The goal here really isn't to commit the strokes and the components etc. to memory, it's just to get a feel for how the character is written, so you can write it without thinking too much, at least right now for the moment. As you do so, you can also review mentally what information you have learned about the character. What does this component mean? What does it do in this character, etc. Once you have a feel for how the character is written and can write it in one go without stopping, you should refrain from copying characters stroke by stroke or writing the character while looking at a model of that character. This type of writing can be good for improving basic penmanship, such as which strokes to use, the stroke placement, the relative size and position of the components, etc., but it's terrible for long-term retention. Instead, you want active recall, so that means that you should not see the answer you're trying to produce. Instead, you rely on some kind of prompt, perhaps the pinyin, perhaps an audio recording, perhaps something else, and then you write the character from memory. Or at the very beginning, you can even look at the character, cover it up, and then write it. But you should never look at the character and copy it as you're looking at it. This has very little effect on your ability to write this character from memory later. This is part of the reason why flashcards can be so useful. So essentially you write the answer on the back and some kind of clue or prompt on the front, and you use these cards to review characters. This doesn't mean you have to use actual flashcards or a flashcard app or write your own manual flashcards, but it does mean that you need active recall. Another thing you need is spaced repetition, so that's when you spread reviews out over time and don't mass repetitions together. So don't write the same character 10 times in a row, write it 10 times over the whole day with other things spread out in between. This is much better from a memory perspective. You don't need a fancy algorithm here to schedule your reviews, and you don't even need to use an app. You just need to spread them out manually, that's fine. In fact, I would even issue a warning against relying on normal spaced repetition apps with flashcards here, because they tend to aim for long-term retention, which is good in most cases, but passing a dictation test is a relatively short-term task, and these apps are not configured to do that normally. In other words, you need many more reviews over a shorter period of time than most of these apps will recommend. What we have discussed so far should allow you to memorize most of the words and characters that you need for the dictation tests, but it's also important that you actually test yourself in a situation similar to the one that will be on the actual tīngxiě in class. Therefore, do a simulated test and see how well you do. Naturally, don't do this 10 minutes before the actual test. You need some time, so if you find errors or things that you didn't know as well as you thought you did, you have some time to recover and fix that. So here is how to set up that simulated test. First, you should use audio prompts. I said earlier that you can use different types of clues to know which character it is you're supposed to write, but on the test itself, your teacher will say things that you're supposed to write down, hence tīngxiě. So you need to use audio as the prompt. You can set up free audio flashcards in Anki, and again I will link to an article where I explain how this works, or you can perhaps use an AI chatbot to generate sentences for you and otherwise mimic the way your teacher conducts these tests. Next, make sure that the items are tested in a random order. It's easy if you study a list that you remember an item in the list because what came before it or after it, but on the exam the teacher might use any order, so this is not a reliable clue and so you should get rid of it. Next, you should answer and grade your answers the same way as on the test. If you're only required to write the target word on the exam, that's what you should practice. And if you are required to also write the pinyin, then you should practice that too. Then you should of course also judge your preparedness based on how you would have scored on the real test. Finally, it doesn't hurt to try to match the physical environment. So for example, if you're going to sit at a desk using a normal pen on paper, then practice using exactly that. There is some research on context-dependent retrieval, essentially meaning that the situation you learned something in can influence how easy you find it to remember it later. So if you learn something in one type of environment, it becomes easier to recall it in that type of environment. The effect is rather different depending on the situation and particulars, so I will include a few research papers in the written article on Hacking Chinese. Like I said though, it doesn't hurt to practice in a similar enough environment. When you've conducted one of these simulated tests, you will probably find that most of the characters and words are okay, but there might be some that just refuse to stick. For these, I suggest you use stronger memory techniques or mnemonics. Describing exactly how to use memory techniques and mnemonics to learn Chinese characters is beyond the scope of this episode, but this is something I have written about extensively, and there are also many podcast episodes about this. If you want to know more, you should check out the article and podcast episode called Remembering is a Skill You Can Learn, Mnemonics for Chinese Learners, and then How to Make Chinese Easier by Using Mnemonics and Memory Techniques. You can also try to increase your exposure to these difficult words by writing them on your hands, using a post-it note and putting them over the sink or somewhere else where you happen to look often. Just looking at the characters will not teach you how to write them by hand, but you can also use this as a prompt to think about the things you learned about these characters. What do the components mean, and what function do these components have in this character, and so on. So there you have it. This method should enable you to get 100% on all dictation tests if you want to, but as we discussed earlier, you probably don't want 100% anyway. There is of course a life after the tīngxiě too, and so some of the things that I've talked about here don't make much sense in the long term. For example, cramming works really well in the short term, but it's vastly outmatched by spaced repetition in the long term. This means that the apps that I told you not to rely on just to prepare for the dictation test become very useful when it comes to long-term retention. There are also other learning principles and strategies that apply when you want to learn hundreds or thousands of characters over months and years, rather than the vocabulary to a specific chapter in your textbook, but this is again outside the scope of this episode, but check the show notes for more reading. So I hope this guide will enable you to get whatever score you want on your upcoming dictation test. If you tried it out, please let me know how it went in the comments. Good luck! Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.